Welcome to Creating Engaging Content with Stella Architect. My name is Kareem Shashakli, and I'm pleased to introduce Billy Schoenberg, one of our leading developers. In fact, he is the lead developer for Stella Architect, to present to you how to use spatial map and doing animations to make your presentations more engaging. Billy has a long history in creating interfaces for other people and also in working in system dynamics, and I'm very pleased to turn things over to him.
Thanks, Kareem. So like Kareem was saying, I've spent a good portion of my career working on interfaces and interface development. And I'm excited to be with you today to show you all about some of the new content within Stella Architect for doing animation and data visualization. So before we get going with content, I just want to teach for those of you who haven't used GoToWebinar before a little bit about the GoToWebinar panel. There's a little grab tab you can use to show and hide things. There's an audio setup panel to make sure that you can hear me. And then at the bottom, there's a space where you can enter in questions. We will be doing a Q&A in this webinar. So any questions you have, feel free to enter them at any time. We'll try and answer as many of them as we can over the air. Those which we can't do over the air, we will do via email. So without much ado, let's head into what we're going to be talking about today. So today, what I want to cover with you is using the IC Exchange. So I want to teach you a bit about what the IC Exchange is, where it is on the web, how you use it, how you can find sims. Then I want to give you the 30,000 foot overview of the interface window in Stella Architect, just so that those of you who are unfamiliar with Architect can follow along with what I'm doing here today. Then we're going to get into the meat of the content, and we're going to start by building a spatial map. And spatial maps are pretty cool. We use them to visualize array-based data. So today's simulation is going to be using an emergency room with 50 beds. So we can use a spatial map to represent each one of the beds in our emergency room. From there, we'll replace our spatial map with an animation. And the animation is a pretty neat data visualization of a hospital emergency room and waiting room. And to develop the animation, you'll need to use what's called an SVG image. SVG meaning Scalable Vector Graphics. And I'll show you a cool little tool that I use to make SVGs so that I can animate them using Stella Architect. And then finally, like I was saying before, we're going to end with around 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So let's get started with the IC Exchange. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just open up Google Chrome. And so you can see here now that I'm at the IC Exchange, which is exchange.icsystems.com. And you can think of it as kind of the home page for system dynamics-based simulations on the web. So here I've got a directory of all of the simulations that have been published to our site and are visible to people who aren't logged in. And so what I can do using this directory is I can search for sims that I'm interested in. So in addition to simulations that are on the Exchange, we also have models, which you can build using Stella Online, our free web-based model editor, as well as causal loop diagrams, which can also be built using Stella Online. But today, what I'm interested in showing you with the IC Exchange is actually a copy of the sim that we're going to be using, which is based on an emergency room. So if I type in emergency room, you'll see here that I get a couple of simulations, two that were created by me, one by somebody else. And the simulation that we're going to build today is the emergency room using the animation object. So I click on that sim, and it opens up, and we can see we get a nice little introductory page, and we hit the Let's Play button. And now we're looking at an animation of an emergency room. So here we've got our waiting room, and the green means good. There's not a long line. In fact, there's nobody waiting in line. There's 7 patients arriving each hour. And then red represents beds that are filled with patients, and white represents beds that don't have patients in them. So I can run this model, and what I can do is I can adjust the arrival rate and increase it. Now you'll see we get a really busy waiting room, and the person who's in the waiting room is getting angry. And if I lower it, we'll see here that the number of people waiting goes down, and that the number of beds in use goes down. We can adjust as well the average treatment time. So the treatment times are according to a normal distribution. So right now it takes on average 4 hours to treat somebody with a standard deviation of 2 hours. If I raise the standard deviation, we'll eventually see that we bottleneck because some patients take a lot longer. All right, so now that we've taken a look at the simulation that we're going to be building today, why don't we actually get into the work of building that simulation? And so what we're going to be starting with today is a model that I've put together of an emergency room. And what's most important to understand is that this stock here, which is actually an oven, represents the beds. And you'll see that there are 50 of them. So if you look at the symbol here, you can see that it's arrayed. And that's how, this is the stock essentially that we're going to be animating. So let's go back up to our interface. And we get to our interface by hitting the presentation button in the upper toolbar of the model window of Stella Architect. And this shows us the interface window of Stella Architect. In the interface window, there's a couple of key things that I want to point out. First being the page list. So just like you have in PowerPoint, a list of slides which will be presented in order here, you've got a list of pages which will be presented in your interface. The key difference, of course, is that pages don't necessarily have to go in order. The order of the pages as they are displayed to the user is based upon the buttons that they click to navigate between the pages. Another key thing in this page list is the context, which allows you to switch from interface pages to templates, which you can think of as slide masters in PowerPoint, or stories. We're not going to cover templates or stories, but I just wanted to let you know that those things are there. We then have the what you see is what you get canvas here in the center, which allows you to place widgets down, size them, position them, and see exactly what they'll look like when they're published online or on tablets or any other device that we support publishing to. Then finally, over here on the right, we have a listing of all of our settings. These settings are context specific based upon whatever you have selected on the what you see is what you get canvas. Along the top of the page is the build toolbar, which is all of the widgets that you can use to put down on the screen. And along the bottom is the run toolbar to run your model. So let's get started by building some of the most basic parts of this simulation. And so let's just start by building that home page for the simulation. And so what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to put down a text box. And if you remember, it was called Emergency EMERGENCY Room Simulator. Pardon my spelling there. So there we go. We've grabbed now this text box, and I got that text box by clicking once on the build toolbar and clicking again on the model view canvas on the interface canvas to place it down. With that text box selected, I can choose what settings are visible in my panel by switching between the wrench and the paint roller. Anytime you see a paint roller, that means styles. And we're going to change the font size from 9, which was the default in this model, to something a fair bit larger, something like 24, which acts as a good title. We're going to center the text to the box. And then what we're going to do is we're going to center the box to the page. Okay. So we've now put together the beginning of our simulation, the title, but there's a step that we forgot. And the step that we forgot is to think about on what screens and what devices our interface is going to be used. And in this case, the simulation that we're developing, I imagine is going to be used on, tablets, and desktops and more modern devices, which actually have a 16:9 aspect ratio as opposed to a 4:3 aspect ratio. And so it's really important to set your page size before you begin developing your content rather than after, so that you can size everything to fit within the space appropriately. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the page size from desktop and tablets to wide desktops and tablets, which is 16:9, which will adjust my page width and page height appropriately. And so if I hide the panel now and I get this thing lined up, we can now see that we've got the title positioned appropriately. Now what I want to do is I want to put in that image. To do that, I'm going to use the graphics button, the graphics widget, which is located in the build toolbar right next to the text box. I click once on it, click again to place it down, double click to open the panel. So if you notice, I hit this little gray triangle to hide the panel. That way I could see my full interface. To bring the panel back, I can hit the gray triangle again, or I can just double click on a widget. In this case, I want to go back to the settings for this widget. So I hit the wrench icon in the settings panel. And I'm going to import the image from a file. And this image is located on my file system right over here. Great. So now I can take this image and resize it. And let's hide this panel again. And let me get the size of the frame to be the size that I want it to be. And that's looking a heck of a lot better. You'll notice that right now, we've got this white box, which is covering part of our image. And that's actually our text box, which is on top of our image. So if I right click on it and send it to the back, it's now behind the image, allowing the image to be uninterrupted. So now we've got our image laid out, and what we finally need on this page is a button, which will eventually bring us to the second page of this simulation. So to do that, I'm going to use the button widget, click once on it, click again to place it down. I want to put it in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This is a pretty common area that people use to naturally look at when they're looking to, change the page in something. So it's a pretty good place to put a button like this. I'm going to double click on this button to bring the panel up, scroll over so I can see the button as I work on it. And I'm going to change the action that this button performs. So buttons can do multiple things, either one at a time or all in a bunch. So if you notice, the button has an action list, meaning it can do many things. In this case, we want the button not to run the model or stop the model or do things like Stella Live, but in fact, we want it to navigate to a page. And we haven't set up that page yet, so I'm going to stop setting up this button right now. And I'm just going to go and fix up its styles. So to fix up its styles, I go and I click on the paint roller. And I'm going to change the font size from 9 to 14. And I prefer my buttons to have a different look than, the default within Architect. I prefer flat buttons, and instead of a background color of gray, I'd like to use green in this case to represent go. And instead of black text, I'd like to use white text, and we can bold that text. And now we've got a really nice looking button, which will at some point link us to the page that we're about to create. So to create a new page in your interface in Stella Architect, what you do is you come to the bottom of the pageless panel and hit the Add Page button. It adds a new thumbnail for us and puts it after the one that we're working on. And so now we've got that page set up. And what we want to do on this page is build out the content of our simulation. And so the easiest way, to get started with this is to work on the numeric displays. And the numeric displays were the devices that were showing us instantaneous values that were being calculated by the model. So if we think of a simulation as a combination of, three kind of abstract concepts, it would be a simulation is a, amalgamation of input devices, things which take, values from users and get calculated in the model. So sliders and knobs and things like that. Output devices, things which show results from the simulation model, things like graphs or tables or numeric displays or gauges, things like that. As well as devices to perform actions, things like buttons, which can run the model, pause the model, stop the model. So to build up our simulation interface, let's start with output devices, and in this case, let's start with the numeric display. So I click once on the numeric display, click again to put it down, double click on it, to get to its panel. I don't want to set up its styles just yet. I want to set up its settings. So I go back to the settings panel, and you'll see here that there's this green plus. And you'll say to me, hey, Billy, what's this green plus all about? And well, if you hover over it, it tells you. And what it does is it allows you to choose a variable to display in the device. So you can type it in directly by hand, but in this case, I much prefer to use the green plus because it gives me a filterable pick list of variables that I can plot. So in this case, the first one that I want to plot is the average cycle time. So I type into this box to filter, and it shows me all of the variables that have AVER in them. And I choose average cycle time. And so now I've got that set up. And I want to give it a title, average cycle time, and that will adjust the capitalization in the box to look a lot nicer. I want to go back to the styles, and we want larger fonts so that they're easier to read, like size 14. I don't want the color to be blue. I want the color to be white. And then let's make it a bit bigger. And now we've got a nice device which is showing us the average cycle time at this point in time in our simulation. So anytime you're building an interface that's composed of multiple widgets which are somewhat like each other within Stella Architect, you'll find quickly that copy-paste is your best friend. So to create the series of numeric displays, the output devices that we saw in this interface, I'm going to copy and paste this widget. So I'm going to right-click on it and hit copy. Right-click again, paste, 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 and paste, and one more. So we've actually got 5 devices which we will eventually be creating. So let me take all of these devices and line them up. And so the reason why we use copy-paste is so that we don't have to go through the process of changing all of the settings to match each and every time. We can do it once and know that by copying and pasting the widget that the settings will match, and all we have to do is change what is different. What I'm doing right now is I'm aligning all of these numeric displays next to each other so that they form a table-like widget. To nudge the widget, I'm actually using the arrow keys to move the widget 1 pixel at a time so that I can get a nice consistent set of borders across all of these widgets. Alrighty, so I've got 4 here, 1 on the top. I don't need this one. Alrighty, so we've got our average cycle time set up. And let's go back to our settings. The next one that we want to choose here is the regular cycle time. So I'm going to hit the green plus, and I'm going to go and filter the list, and we're going to plot cycle time. And I'm going to change the title to just be plain old cycle time. Then I'm going to grab the next numeric display. I'm going to hit the green plus, and this is going to be the average occupancy rate. And then finally, we need to change the label. So average occupancy rate. And now what we're going to do is set up our occupancy rate here. So the difference between the average occupancy rate and the occupancy rate is the average is smoothed over time, whereas the non-averages are actually instantaneous values. So it helps give us an idea of what's going on at one point in time versus what's going on across the entire simulation run up until this point in time. Alrighty. So now we've got all of our numeric displays set up with the exception of this one up here. And if you remember, this one up here was time. So I know the variable is called clock. So I can type directly into the variable picker here, and it shows me, the variable that I want to plot. And the title here is hour. Alrighty, so now we've got our numeric displays set up. So we've got one of the 3 parts of our simulation, interface set up. We have the output devices. Next, we need to set up the input devices. So in that case, this would be the knobs. So to choose the knob, I'm going to go up to the build toolbar, click once on the knob, click again to place it down, double click to open the panel, and you'll see our friendly green plus, which allows us to choose the variable that this knob is going to control. And in this case, I want the knob to adjust the average patient arrival rate. which is the average arrival rate. And by default, knobs will, come up with a minimum or maximum for their values. It will use the scales and ranges panel on the model layer, for those of you who are familiar with the Stella Professional scales and ranges panel. But if you have nothing set up in your scales and ranges panel, it's always smart to override the defaults that Stella Architect gives you in the absence of any other value. And in this case, I know I didn't set up ranges for these devices inside my scales and ranges panel. So I want to adjust the minimum to be, no patients arriving an hour, to 20 patients arriving in an hour in increments of 1, because we want people, to arrive as whole numbers, if at all possible. We want to adjust the title for this knob to be average arrival rate. And let's make this knob a bit bigger and place it right here. And we'll leave that knob set. Now we need to copy and paste this knob and set up 2 more knobs for average treatment time and standard deviation of treatment time. So I right-click copy, paste once, paste twice, click the first one, and we'll change that variable from average arrival rate to average patient treatment time, and we'll change the title to average treatment time. And let me capitalize time appropriately. Very good. And our average treatment times in this model are a minimum of no time to a maximum of 10 hours in increments of half an hour. Let's adjust now our standard deviation treatment time. And so that I'm going to use the green plus again. And this is standard deviation patient treatment time. And that goes from 0 to 10 in increments of 0.5. Not 1.5, 0.5. Much better. And we'll change the title to be standard deviation of treatment time. Excellent. So now we've got our knobs set up. And we want to distinguish our arrival rate knobs from our treatment time knobs. So it would be nice to use the same color that we're going to use for patients for our treatment time knob. So I'm going to double click this, and I'm going to change the color from green to red. And if I scroll over, you can see that. I'm going to change this one to the same red. Awesome. All righty. So now we've got our input devices, our output devices. Now all we need is a device to run the model. So I like to use, green to represent run. And to do that, we're going to use a button like we used on the first page of the simulation. So let's actually go back to the first page of the simulation and link it to this second page. Then we can copy the button off the first page of the simulation, paste it into the second, and adjust it for our uses. So in this case, we are now looking at the navigate to page home page. We don't actually want to go to the home page of the simulation. We want to go to page 2. So now we've set that up, right? And we want to adjust the title of this to, rather than say page 2, to say let's get started. And so if we look at this, we now have a nice clean button, which I'm going to right-click copy. And without clicking anywhere on the page, I'm going to go edit, paste, and it's going to put it in the same exact position that it was on the previous page on this page. That way I can be sure that all of my buttons line up nice. So I'm going to take this button now and I'm going to double click it and I'm going to change it up. So let's get rid of the label. We don't need that anymore. We don't want this button to navigate to a page. We want this button to run the model. So now when we look at this button, it's all set up. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm actually going to save my work. So I'm going to hit File, Save As, and I'm going to just put this up on my desktop over here. And, it's a good habit to get into to save your work, but if you don't get into that habit, you don't have to worry. The Stella Architect has, built into it automated crash recovery systems, which automatically saves your file in the background every 1 to 3 minutes. So in the event that Architect stops working for some reason, not that it happens very often, but in case it does, we're able to recover your work from anywhere between 1 to 3 minutes in the past. So that's pretty good insurance policy. So now that we've saved our model, let's go ahead and let's present it. So I'm going to move my cursor over to this presentation mode icon in what we call the mode toolbar, which is right next to the build toolbar. And I'm going to hit it once, and now it's actually giving me a preview of my simulation. So I can run this model, and we can see that all of the values are updating. And if we adjust the average arrival rate, we'll see that our occupancy rate hits 100%, and our average occupancy rate is rising. So we know that our interface is working well. To get out of this mode, I hit the escape key, and it brings me back to the editing mode, where we can continue to build our interface. So now let's go ahead and let's build a spatial map. We're going to use the spatial map to represent the beds in this hospital. So to get a spatial map, you hover over the spatial map tool, click once, click again to put it down, double click on it to bring open the settings panel, and hit the green plus like any other widget. The spatial map widget only shows up when you have arrayed variables in your model. That's because the spatial map works on arrayed data. So the variable that I want to plot here is beds, and I want to plot all of the beds. So I choose star, which means all subscripts for bed. The next thing I want to do is I want to show cell borders so that we can see the distinction between the various beds in this spatial map. So a spatial map, you can think of kind of like a big, grid of squares. And each square represents one of the array elements in your model. So I'm going to show values in this cell, and you'll see that the beds have values of either 1 or 0, 1 meaning a patient in it, 0 meaning a patient not in it. So let's adjust the color scheme that we use to transform numeric values into color values to represent the patients in our bed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this yellow because all we need is white and red. So let's get rid of that yellow. Let's change, this range start. It starts at 0. So 0 is white, meaning nobody's in the bed. And red, instead of being 100, is the value of 1, which means there's somebody in the bed. So now that we've set up this color scheme, we can go back, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually restore all devices, which is going to clear all of the simulation data out of the model and reset it to initial values. And I'm going to go back into presentation mode here, and we can see that as we run this model, the beds fill and people leave, just as they would in the animation that we were looking at. So spatial map is most commonly used to represent geographic data, things in both an X and a Y plane. And it's really nice, for like fire spread models or things like that. It's not arguably the best for this emergency room visualization. What would be a heck of a lot better is an SVG animation like the one that we were looking at before. So I'm going to escape out of here, and I'm going to show you, and I'm going to save this interface by hitting Control S. I'm going to show you how to build a little SVG animation. So I'm going to take the animation object. I'm going to click once to get it, click once again to put it down, double click. And what the first thing it asks us for is an SVG file to animate. We need to give it a piece of SVG that it can then manipulate. So let's go ahead and create that SVG document. So to do that, I'm going to go to my web browser, and a link for this free online SVG editor that I'm using here will be made available to you via email and on request. This is, not the only SVG editor that you can use. You can use anything that creates, valid SVG. This is the one that I'm using here because it's free. And it does the things that I need it to do, and it has a nice set of pre-built-in icons that I kind of like. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to do in this SVG editor is we want to change the image size. And we do that by going to Document Properties, and we change the canvas dimensions. I actually wanted them to be 700 by 500. I guess it remembered my preferences. So in this case, I know my emergency room is 700 pixels wide by 500 pixels tall, so it's good. The next thing I want to do is create the boundaries for my emergency room. So I'm going to do that using the rectangle tool. I'm going to click once on it and click and drag to put it down. And so we'll see here that, it's created this, red box with a thick black border. And that's all controlled via these tools here at the bottom. So I've got a stroke width of 5, which is the thick border, and a fill color of red. So I don't want the fill color to be red. I want the fill color to be light gray. And so that fixes that problem for me. Now I want to put another rectangle down to represent the waiting room. Oops, and you'll see here that you need to go back to the arrow tool every time, otherwise it's just going to keep creating rectangles. So I can hit delete to get rid of that. And I'm going to get this lined up appropriately. I'm going to use the arrow keys to nudge it in place. And you see here now that we've got, a floor plan that's beginning to look like the one in the simulation that I was showing you before. So the next thing we want to do is create another rectangle to break this wall between the waiting room and the rest of the emergency room. So I do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the border width down to 0. So I just get one solid gray rectangle. And now we've got a nice floor plan that looks like an emergency room. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down the person that represents, the person in the waiting room and a couple of the beds. To do that, we come over here to the shape library and we go into miscellaneous. And there's a nice icon that it calls man. I call it person, which I can place down. And I'm going to place it right here. But it's a bit too thick on the stroke. So let's knock that down. Alrighty. And so now we've got a person icon. And what we want to do is we want to make them look like they're laying down to represent a bed. So I can use this little grab handle here to do that. Let me get it. There we go. I can put them over here. And you'll notice that here on this toolbar on the top, I can type in specific values for angles and things like that. So I've got them, a person laying down. And you'll notice next that we've got a field here, which is the ID for the widget. This is useful for when it comes time to identifying parts of your SVG image within Stella Architect. This is how it's done, using IDs and classes. So I'm going to call this one bed 1. If I take this person and I right-click copy, right-click paste, I believe I can rotate them. Nope, bug in the editor. So if I, I'll have to create a new person, get them set up, rotate them appropriately. Let's just set that to -90. Alrighty, we can get them lined up next to each other here. Size them to be approximately the same. And this one we'll call bed 2. So I'm not going to go through creating all 50 beds with you. So let's create the next part of this animation, which is the person in the waiting room. So to do that, I take the person again, and I'm going to put them down here. And I'm going to, again, I forgot about hitting the arrow button. So I'm going to grab this person and slide him over here. Get him positioned. And that'll be the person in the waiting room. So I will call this person waiting room. And we can put down text as well. So I can put down a piece of text, put a number in it. In this case, I put 88. I can grab that piece of text. I want 88. There we go. Now let's change it from serif to sans serif. And you can see here how we're putting together the various elements that we're going to be animating. In this, I'll call it, waiting room text. So rather than continuously, bore you guys with, the actual creation of the piece of SVG, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another copy of this editor, and I'm going to open up for you an example of one of the ones I've already created. So I'm going to hit Open SVG and grab this one here. And you can see here, I've laid out all 50 people. That's waiting text. This is arrivals text. This, could be the waiting room. This is a bed. And we're going to use all of this to identify the various pieces that when we go to animate. To save a piece of SVG from this tool, what we do is we hit this little SVG button, which lists out all of the markup for the SVG. We can right-click, copy it. We can then come back to our desktop. And I'm just going to get back to our desktop over here. And what I can do is create a new file. And let's hide that here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this from new text document to, ER dot instead of txt SVG. And yes, I want to change it. And then I'm going to right click and open with a tool like Notepad++ or Notepad. Paste it, save it, close. And now when I open this thing, you'll see that it's actually, an image. And there's the image. In this case, though, we don't actually want to use, this one that we put together. We want to use the one that I've already made. So to do that, I'm going to hit Browse, and I'm going to choose this piece of SVG. Oops, that's not the one I want. So let's go here, graphics, right, righty. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this one that I put here on my desktop. Okay. And I'm going to browse again and choose the one I want. There we go. I'm going to size this to be the size I want. And before deleting this spatial map, I know I'm going to be using this color scheme again. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to export this color scheme to a file so that I can reuse it later on. So I do that by hitting Export to File. And I give this thing a name, and we'll call this Beds Scheme. And I'll save that. Now I can get rid of that spatial map. We can place our animation down on the page appropriately, get it all centered and positioned up, and double click on it and begin to set it up. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a transformation which is going to highlight the people in the beds. So I'm going to do that by hitting the green plus on the style transform, and I'm going to use this finger button to select the part of the document that I want to manipulate, bed number 1. And I want to change bed number 1's fill color. And so here's where we're going to import from file that color scheme that we have already created. So there it is with the 0 and the 1. And we'll call it, beds scheme. And we hit OK. So we want to change the fill color according to the bed scheme using the variable beds number 1. So the first bed is going to change the first person in this picture's fill color according to the color scheme bed scheme. And once we do that, you'll see this person is now red because there's a bed, there's a person in that bed. So if I hit the green plus, let's do it for bed 50. So I'm going to choose this selector. I'm going to choose the 50th bed, and I hit OK. And I'm going to change the attribute, fill color, according to the bed's color scheme. And the variable I want to use is beds 50. And there's a person in this bed too. If I restore all devices, now there's no person in this bed and a person in that bed. So you see how this begins to work. Let me show you how you can change the values for text. To do that, you use the green plus, and we use the picker again, and we select the text that we want to change, and we hit OK. And the value we want to change is the text value, not the fill color or anything else like that. We want to change the text value. And we can do this by linking it directly to the variable waiting room. And when we do that, the number changes. Let's set up a new color scheme to color the person in the waiting room. To do that, I'm going to use the green plus, and this is going to be waiting room. And what I want to do is add two values, and let's say 100. Let's say 100 is where we want the person to appear red, and at 0 we want them to appear green. But then what we can do is we can check off, like is checked off here, blend colors to blend smoothly between 0 and 100 from green to red to represent the transition of this person from being, a clean, nobody waiting their waiting room to a very busy, hectic waiting room. And so we hit OK on that. Now we've created that color scheme, and now we need to apply it. So we use the green plus in the style transformation, and we select this person, the person who represents the waiting room. We hit OK, and we change their fill color according to the waiting room color scheme, according to the variable waiting room. So now if we preview this model and we run, we can see that as we jack up the arrival rate, this bed gets filled, this person goes, from green to red, and if we lower the arrival rate, this bed will eventually become empty, and this person changes color seamlessly. So this is how we can create animations using Stella Architect. The final thing I want to tell you about the animation widget is that it's capable of doing more than just animating colors and text. You're also able to move stuff and change the size of things and rotate things. But that's not something that I'm going to cover during today's webinar, because I want to make sure that I leave appropriate time for questions. So what I'm going to do now is come back here, and we're going to choose the presentation appropriately. This is the link to that online SVG editor. I'll make sure that you all get a copy of it in the email that we send out after this webinar. And what I'd like to do is open the floor to questions and let you know that we've got webinars coming up on October 17th for building multiplayer simulations with Stella Architect. In November, we've got a paid series that we're going to be putting on all about interactive learning environments, and we're going to go over the theory and the design of learning environments so that you can appropriately create learning environments that target your users' specific pedagogical needs. And then finally, we're going to end the year with a webinar all about authentication and data collection and how you can use those features to analyze data that comes out of your simulation to learn more about what your participants are learning. So with that, Kareem, questions?
Thank you, Billy. Great presentation. We have a question that I've already answered privately, but you might want to just talk about it quickly. If you've developed an interface in a given Stella model, how can you replace the underlying model if someone else is working on it and changing it?
Sure. So let me come back here to Architect. And if we come up to the interface window, you'll see an interface. There's an option to replace the model. And this is really useful if you're collaborating with a team of people where there's a group of people who are building the model and there's a person who's building the interface. What you can do is build the interface on top of one version of the model. And when they develop a new version of the model, as long as the variables that you're using in your interface haven't changed, and by that I mean their name, you can replace the model underneath your interface, swapping it out to get the updated model logic.
Thank you, Billy. The next question is, tricky because there could be more than one answer, but I've developed a model using Vensim, which doesn't have anything close to these interface tool sets. Would I need to recreate my model in Stella to use the Architect interface tools?
Not necessarily. So there's a couple of things that are going on. One, there's the first thing is that Stella uses an open standard called XMile to represent its models, which is an XML-based standard for representing models. Anyway, that standard is in the process of being implemented by Ventana Systems. And there are translators out there in the open source world which are able to for some models, appropriately translate just the model content from the Vensim MDL format to the XMile format, which Stella and other tools are capable of reading.
When you say just the model part, what do you mean by that?
I mean the equations as well as the stock and flow diagrams, but any graphs or tables or VenApps that you've created will not be translatable, at least not at this point in time.
Thank you. Yeah, so the diagram comes across with it. And if you need help with those tools, we could help you. The Vensim to Stella conversion process you asked, if you couldn't do that, is straightforward. It is fairly straightforward. A lot of people do it.
Yes, if you're going to do it by hand, the set of built-ins between Stella and Vensim are in many cases similar. I'd say they share about 70–80% of the built-ins. And of course, they're all built around the system dynamics methodology. Models are translatable using a brute force method.
By which he means by doing it by hand.
Right.
Next question. For sizing an SVG with the quantities of a stock, is there a way to set an upper and lower limit to the size of the image?
So the way you would do that is you would control it all using model logic. So what I like to do when I'm moving stuff around in SVG images is I'm typically representing the states of the stock. And so what I'll do is I'll make a converter which uses the stock and calculates an appropriate value either by putting it inside of a min-max function so that it's always between a range, or multiplying by some conversion unit between like let's say acres to pixels or something like that, so that I can appropriately position stuff. Using kind of output variables like that to animate, especially locations within your SVG document, is definitely the preferred approach. If you've got more questions about that, the best way to get them answered is to email either support or myself, and or both. What we can do is share with you an example of a model that is manipulating the location of items within an SVG picture. That way you can see how I've done it.
So Billy, without actually going into that, a lot of people may not even have understood completely the question. Do you have a short example that shows what we're talking about?
Yes, I do. Let me come into Architect here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a model, which I'd be happy to share with anybody here, which is cows in a field of grass. Okay, and so if we look at this, what you can do is you can see here that the cows move across the field as the simulation changes. So that's what we're talking about by moving or scaling images. To be a bit more concrete about how this works, if we come into the model here, you'll look and you'll see that what I'm actually animating is SVG cow X and SVG cow Y, which are actually direct flips from the way that the model deals with these values. And then I do a transformation process to turn the units in this model are acres into pixels, so that I can get the cows in the appropriate spot on the page.
Thank you, Billy. And as well as moving things, you can also change their size and rotate them
Correct.
through the same transformations. Right.
Correct.
Great. Okay. Um, that's all the questions we have. If anyone has something else, you have a few seconds to send something in. Otherwise, we're all done. Do you have anything you want to add, Billy, before we close?
No, that's it. I'd encourage many of you to come back next month when we do our presentation on multiplayer simulations with Stella Architect. That's really cool, I promise. So what you can do is you can get multiple people, spread out either across the world or on different machines, all interacting with the same simulation model. And you can do that using Stella Architect, essentially for free if you already own a license to Architect. Is really neat, and that'll be a pretty fun webinar. So hopefully I'll see you all in about a month.
Thank you. There's one more question, which I'll answer quickly, that just came in. So Architect can now create agent-based models is the question, and you've been able to do it in Stella since version 4. This is not new, it's just most people don't know how to do it.
Right.
So we have some examples, and we made a bunch of examples available when Spatial Map came out way back in, wow, 2006 maybe. So if you need help with that, we can help you. There's also, we had a free webinar by Ken Thompson where he talks about it near the end, about creating small agent-based models within his SD model.
Yeah. Essentially, the crux of it is lots and lots of arrays.
Well, some arrays. Depends on the model.
Yes, of
But
course.
it's array-based. There are no more questions. Thank you for joining us today.
And I hope you all
See
have
you
a
next
very
month.
good afternoon, and see you next month.